welcome to the channel. So I get asked a lot of questions about long range shooting, and the main questions I get asked are actually about optics. So it's probably because optics tend to be really expensive for decent quality. Most people have got no problem paying out a large amount of money for a cool looking rifle, but when it comes to putting a scope on top, they're like, can I save some money? So we aim to have a look at that, have a think about whether you actually need to buy a really expensive optic, and if you do need to buy an expensive optic, what type of features and benefits to look out for. I've got something I really like here, so it's a kind of bit of a review and overview of that optic as well, but mainly it's just going to help you guys make your minds up on what you need and why you need it. So what kind of shooting do you do? That's really going to answer your question about what sort of optic you need. If you're doing extreme long range, say you shoot regularly over 800 meters and you're sometimes shooting in low light or misty conditions, rain, really high sunlight with a lot of shadow, so it depends on targetry as well. Are your targets on a gallery range really clearly defined all the time, just white targets against a clear background? You've got high contrast between the target and background, then you can probably get away with something a little cheaper if you're at short ranges with those high contrast targets. So if you go down the range once a month and you shoot at like 100 meters against standardized rifle targets on a standard background, you could probably get away with like a £300 or £400 scope. The only reason you'd want to spend that much is because you want something that's actually going to handle the recoil of the weapons you're shooting. If you're going to buy an air gun or like a 2.2 long rifle, save yourself that money as well. You can probably buy a £100 scope and it's going to be fine. You know, people talk about like spring air rifles are going to wreck your scope. They're not. There's hardly any recoil to any of those things. I don't care which direction the recoil travels in because of the spring or whatever. That's a load of old nonsense. You can get away with a pretty cheap scope for those things. As soon as you step up into the realms of like 6mm, 6.5, 7.62, recoil starts having an effect and it starts breaking things. So that's where it's worth investing in a more expensive scope. Then you've got a step beyond that where you actually need to see things at really long range. So that's where expensive glass comes in, because if you don't pay the money for the glass, you haven't got that quality, you're not going to see what you're shooting at. So if you're shooting at 1,000 meters, you need high quality glass to actually see what you're shooting at. And most importantly, you need to see full of shot, so you need to see where you've missed so you can actually get onto the target. You don't actually need to see like an exact hit on the target, you need to see where you haven't hit the target, because generally speaking, like a still's going to let you know. If you shoot paper, you don't see a splash around the paper. You know, maybe a spotter will tell you you've hit, but still to let you know. But you need to see when you haven't hit the target. And the other thing that's really important from the safety perspective, that if you can't see the target area properly, then you don't actually know that it's safe to take a shot. So you have to be able to tell if someone's wandered in there, if an animal's wandered across. And I've been in the middle of nowhere before and like people have walked across target areas. That happens all the time, even on clearly marked military ranges. Doesn't matter, you get these random people that turn up with like their cagoules on and a map, sort of looking around puzzled and wondering what red flags are for. Yeah, they're for shooting ranges. It's live. So you need to be able to see what you're doing. So if we've established that you actually do need a high quality scope, oh, and I should caveat that if you're someone that has to have the reliability, so like you're a professional shooter that cannot have a scope breakdown on you in the field, or you're in the military, law enforcement, and it's like life or death if that weapon is working and your scope is working for you properly, obviously you're going to pay the extra money, not just for the clarity through the glass, but also like the basic reliability of the scope, so things don't break down. Because scopes, the cheaper the scope is, generally the less reliable it becomes. And if you're a hobby shooter, that's no big deal, you can take your chances. But if you're a professional shooter, that may not be an option for you. Okay, so we've decided you fit the criteria of needing this expensive scope. If you do go to buy a scope, firstly think about your magnification level. You're probably going to want mixed mag, because most scopes these days are mixed magnification. It used to be you get like a fixed 12 power, there was a lot of those around, or fixed 6 power, not so much anymore. It really pays to have mixed mag, because if you're fixed at a higher power, it can be difficult to take note of all your surroundings. So to pick your targets to begin with, it's quite nice to dial out to a low power, and that also gives you you're able to observe, you know, the field that you're shooting on. If you're looking for animals, movement, stuff like that, or if you're in the military, you want to actually see what's in front of you on a larger scale than just zoomed right into the target. So normally speaking, I think most of the tactical kind of scopes these days are probably up to about 25 power. So something like a 5 to 25 is around about the average range, and that's just fine. You know, I've shot out to 2,000 meters with 25 power, no problem at all. Just bear in mind that, again, if you scrimp on cost and you scrimp on glass quality, the more you dial the magnification up, the less light you let through the scope and the less you're going to be able to see, especially in bad light conditions. So again, that's why people buy really expensive scopes, so they can dial up the mag and they can still see what they're shooting at. So a scope I like to use is the Delta Optics. This is a 4.5 by 30. So we're in the ballpark of what we were talking about. And this is a first focal plane scope. So what is first focal plane? What is second focal plane? First focal plane refers to the reticle. As you dial in the mag, as you zoom the mag in, then the reticle gets larger as well. The benefit of that is it's always going to tell you exactly what your mil dots are, or your MOA hash marks are, and they're going to be correct. So you would use these, for example, if you're trying to range a target and you use a calculation based off your reticle to range a target, or if you're trying to gauge fall of shot, how many minutes of angle or mil radians you are off of target, and then once you've seen that through your reticle, you can make that adjustment through your turrets. So one of the first things I look out for is, do the turrets match the reticle? Because there used to be a trend for having mil radian reticles with MOA turrets, and I just think that's crazy, because you've got to calculate the difference every time you make an alteration to the turret. It's like 1 mil is about, I think, 3.6 MOA, but I don't want to be doing that calculation every time I make an adjustment. So if it's mil, I can just see, okay, I've missed the target to the right by 2 mil through my reticle. I then make that adjustment 2 mil on the turret, simple. And once I've got my zeros for wind, etc., I'll just use the reticle for aiming off anyway. So my choice is FFP. The reason that people might not like FFP is if you do a lot of close range shooting, sometimes if you want to dial up the mag, so like bench rest shooters, 100-meter bench rest shooters, they really like to dial up high mag, and for those guys the reticle then becomes so big in comparison to the target, which is only like 100 meters away, it can actually start interfering with their ability to see targets, especially if they're shooting like a small target. Some of the bench rest targets are really tiny little things, so they wouldn't like that. They would want a finer reticle, and they'd probably go second focal plane. In second focal plane, the reticle doesn't change size, so the benefit of that is that you can always probably have a good view on target, because the reticle's always taking up the whole of the scope, and it's, you know, been graduated so that it's fine enough not to like cloud the target. On the downside, it's not always going to be correct depending on which magnification you're at. Most of the SFP scopes have a demarcation on the mag ring. So generally somewhere around 10, 15 power, sometimes 20 power, something like that. It will be in yellow or red, the number, as opposed to all the other numbers being in white. And that means that magnification, the scope will be correct in terms of what you get in your reticle will be mil radians or MOA. For everything else, it will be incorrect. So I'm a little bit wary of those, because even if you're not quite on that number, if you're shooting at like extreme long range, you need everything to be 100% correct. And if you're not quite on that number, or the scope isn't quite calibrated properly, you're going to have error, and you don't want error. So I go for FFP. I then go for something with enough elevation. So that's really vital, that you buy a scope with enough elevation, because otherwise you're going to be disappointed. What you can do is cant the scope. So when you mount the scope to a rifle, you see things talking about 20 MOA cant or 10 MOA cant, and that basically means all that's happening is you're canting the scope that way. So that's just giving you an increased amount of elevation. It's basically, when you start out with the scope, if you set it to the middle, so it's pointing in like a horizontal line with your bore, you're not using the elevation. You're only using half the elevation as you come up, because you're coming up from middle. If you cant the scope, you're basically buying yourself a load of extra elevation out of that increased level of adjustment. So you can buy yourself like an extra 20 MOA. There's no reason I wouldn't do that, like, unless I was going to change calibers on the rifle for something completely different. But if I was shooting like 308, I would straight away stick a 20-minute rail on there, same going upwards. The only time I've seen it problematic is, when I've used rifle with like 40 MOA cants on, and then sometimes you've burnt up so much at the bottom end that you can't actually get the thing zeroed properly. But that's pretty rare, and in fact, if you've got issues and you really need a ton of cant on the scope for like extreme long range shooting, there are a couple of mounts you can buy that have adjustable cant in them. We use one on a 50 cal, and it's pretty good actually. I think it adjusts up to something like 150 minutes of cant, something like that. So there's plenty there. We normally keep it set at 20, and then if we've been out to extreme long range, we've just added it when we needed to. But that works absolutely fine. The other thing of concern on the scope is parallax. So most people don't understand what parallax is. It generally adjusts on the opposite side to the windage. So I've got a parallax here, it's got a bunch of numbers on it, and they'll say things like 0 up to 1,000 or 2,000 or infinity, and you might wonder what they are. Well, they're actually referring generally to yards. That's the range. So the reason that you've got parallax is because it's to do with the focal plane of your reticle and target. So I always imagine it like this. If you hold your two fingers up and you imagine the rear finger is your reticle and this front finger is the target you're looking at, and then if you focus on the rear finger like you would, like you're looking at a sight, and then you bring your head up and down, that rear finger appears to move in context to the front finger, the target, but neither of them are actually moving. It's just your eyes playing a trick. If you move the fingers closer together, there's no movement, or there appears to be no movement. The further apart you put the fingers, the more movement there appears to be. That's what happens in the lenses of a rifle scope. So without getting too technical, we don't need to worry about why that occurs. We just need to know that it does. And the parallax adjustment basically brings those two things closer together. So if you move your head behind the reticle, you're not seeing the reticle move around in comparison to the target. that's the way to check your parallax. So if you see a guy at the range wobbling his head around behind the scope, he's not like he's not an idiot, or he's not having some kind of issue. He knows what he's doing. He's checking his parallax. So it's not about, people think that they can check it by just being in focus. No, that isn't correct. It isn't a focus knob. Yes, it does bring the target into focus, but perfect parallax is checked by moving your head and checking that there's no reticle movement. When you move your head behind the reticle, make sure you're holding that rifle stock still. So put it on, you know, if it's on a bag or tripod on a rear bag, something like that, keep it stock still and just move your head and make sure your body isn't moving the rifle. Then just alter the parallax until you don't get any more reticle movement. I like nice big adjustment turrets, and I like them to be very clear on their clicks, so when you turn them you get a nice clear defined click, and more to the feel of the click than the sound. I don't particularly want it to make a noise, but I just want to feel each click on there. And this one has locking turrets, so if you pull it up you can adjust, and then you push it down, that locks the turret in place. That's a really good system because I don't want those things moving around in the bag and then I go to shoot and everything's out. The next thing I want on the turrets is zero stops. So on these, firstly I can slip to zero, so once I've zeroed my scope, you might find once it's zeroed it will read like, you know, whatever number on there, but it won't be zero because it isn't necessarily going to be on zero when you've zeroed at your chosen range. You might zero at 300 meters, you might zero at 100. What you can do on this one is unscrew that top piece, and that allows this to just come off, and without clicking you can just slip it back to zero and then screw that top back on. You know everything's good. You can do the same thing on the windage. It's also got hard zero stop, so again you can undo this, slip this whole piece off, and under there's some Allen screws that you can set a hard zero stop with. So a hard zero stop is so you can make sure you're not ever going to go below zero when you're dialing. And the reason you want to do that is because if you're out at ranges and you're shooting mixed distances, it's really easy to kind of forget where you are. Most scopes have like a little demarcation on the turret somewhere to kind of tell you how many times you've been round, but it's a hell of a lot easier just to dial it back to a hard zero, especially if you're in low light and stuff like that. So hard zero, I can just wind it down, boom, I hit hard zero. Now I know my zero distance 100 meters, then I can start turning again. So if I'm shooting at 500, I know my dope for 500, I just make that adjustment from my hard zero. If I get lost and I start making adjustments and I'm going one way and the other on the scope and I'm not quite sure where I am, forget it. You know, you're really lost. And if you haven't got a hard zero, you can end up dialing down way below zero and then you're absolutely lost. So I think that is a necessity. I like a scope with a firm but smooth magnification ring. It's important to be firm. People complain about them being firm, but that's important because you don't want them just slipping up and down, you know, and changing your mag without you realising it. I quite like the fact this one has a lever on it, so I can actually move that really nicely. You'll find that they get harder to turn in cold weather because they've got like some grease in there, and as it gets warmer the grease warms up and they become a lot easier to move. But these levers on them really help. I've got a 34mm tube on there. Again, you're paying for something that's quite rugged. A 34mm tube is going to be more rugged and more able to take knocks and bumps than like the old 1-inch tubes. The other reasons for it, there's two other reasons. One, they let more light through, so the more light you can get through, the better clarity of optic you've got. Number two, you're asking for a lot of elevation in scopes these days. So if you want 35mm of elevation or 100 MOA of elevation, then the mechanics in the scope have to be able to cope with that, and the only way that they can cope with that is by having enough room to move, because it's literal mechanics moving up and down. You know, these things aren't digital. So the only way you can ensure that that happens is by giving it enough volume inside the scope housing itself to do so. So that the large sort of bell that holds the turrets in the middle is where all the mechanics are, and it would be pretty ridiculous to have a massive large bell piece in the middle and then like tiny little tubes coming off, and it would be weak. As soon as you knock them, you know, the weight of the middle section with those tiny tubes, they would just break off it. So it makes a lot more sense. Everything's a trade-off in shooting, so you're paying for, you know, light transfer, you're paying for like the robustness of the thing, but you're going to pay for that in weight. So always remember that, you know, because there's some manufacturers out there like US Optics make really robust scopes, but they weigh a lot. You know, the Night Force ATAC-R, really good scope, really robust, it weighs a lot. This is kind of middle of the road. This Delta Stryker comes in at about 1,042 grams, which in scope terms is pretty reasonable. The next thing I look out for, and I'm taking it for granted all these scopes have got decent glass. You know, we're not talking about cheap scopes here. The next thing I look out for is warranty. So all scopes tend to have different warranty. The manufacturers carry different warranties. This one has a 10-year warranty, which is decent. Vortex have probably the best warranty on the market. They'll literally replace the scope. As long as you send them parts back, they'll replace it, and it doesn't matter if you run it over, it doesn't matter if you dropped it down a mountain or it's just gone wrong. Whatever it is, they'll replace the scope. So you can't say fairer than that. I don't know if that's on all their models, but it's certainly on the higher end models. I've had like a Viper PST replaced. We've got a couple of razors. They're under the replacement guarantee. It's like a no questions asked thing. And Vortex are really good to deal with, so I've had no issues there. So you might consider that when you're considering like how reliable and how robust your platform is. You might consider the warranty as part of that. Is actually, you know, that Vortex scope is 100% reliable, because even if it breaks down, they're going to send you another one. And if you're a hobby user, that's awesome. If you're working in the field, you might want to look at a scope, you know, that's never going to fail. But I don't know of one. I've seen all scopes fail in certain circumstances, and sometimes you just get unlucky. You know, these manufacturers, they're big production lines, they've got good quality control, but you can't always guarantee that everything's going to work 100% of the time. Other than that, the most important thing, and this isn't about the scope, it's actually the mounts. I use spur mounts, or spur mounts, however you want to call it. Gone are the days when mounts were pretty awful. I remember, you know, like 20 odd years ago, mounts were so bad that people would buy them and then spend ages lapping them. So they would put these two metal pointy pins into the rings. The pins wouldn't touch each other, which told you that the rings were slightly out in terms of how they'd been made. And then people would get these rods and put some grinding paste on them and work these things in and out, do all kinds of things to try and get these two metal pins to meet in the middle, so that they knew that the rings were totally on point. If you've got really old scope rings or really cheap scope rings that aren't correct, they're probably going to damage your scope. They're certainly going to pull your scope off of where it should be pointing, which you don't want, especially if you're long range shooting. And worst case scenario, they will actually damage your scope, because if they're not cut perfectly round or cut perfectly to size, when you tighten them down, they're going to start crushing the tube of your scope. And then, while we're mentioning that, buy a torque wrench, for God's sake, buy a torque wrench, because the amount of people that spend like $3,000 or $4,000 on a scope, and then they come back and say, oh, it's not working properly, and that's because they've hand tightened everything to like as strong as their arm could possibly tighten it, because they didn't want it to move, and then they find out they've crushed the tube of the scope. And funnily enough, the reason that often scopes begin to move under recoil is because all of the screws on the scope rings haven't been tightened to the same level. So if you tighten some more than others, under recoil, the looser ones, that vibration, because they're looser, they will start to move under vibration, and they're not going to tighten themselves up, they're going to undo. So if you use a torque wrench and you ensure that everything is cinched down to like 25 inch-pounds, that's generally what I tighten the rings to, then all at 25 inch-pounds I don't get any movement. I don't think I've ever had a scope that I've torqued down come loose. I've never had to use any thread locker on them. I tighten the mounts themselves down to normally 50 inch-pounds, sometimes 40 if the manufacturer is particular about 40, but check what the manufacturer of the mounts and the scope says, go by that. But generally speaking, 25 inch-pounds for the rings, 40 inch-pounds for the base, or 50 inch-pounds for the base if you really want to stick it there on a 50. I generally stick it at 50 inch-pounds, and I've never had any movement. So guys, just mount them properly, and when you are scope mounting, take your time. You know, it's not a 5-minute job at the range, it's an hour to 2 hour job to get it right, because when you mount the scope, you're not just getting it there and forgetting about it. You want to make sure that your eye relief between the back of the scope and your eye is great, and that every not just prone, but every type of shooting you're doing, whether it's in different positions, standing, kneeling, barricades, unusual positions from barricades if you're shooting PRS or something like that, all those positions will change the distance that you generally have your eye to the back of the scope, just because your body's in different positions. So you want to find eye relief on that scope that is suitable for all of that. I've seen scopes set up where, you know, they're so far forward or so far back that as soon as you change position, you actually lose sight picture, and you start having to crank your head back and forwards on the rifle to try and get something. And you should always be comfortable on the rifle. You should almost be able to, in a prone position on a rifle, you should be able to pretty much fall asleep on it. So if you're having to crank your muscles, you're going to be adding extra movement to the rig, and that's the last thing you want to do. I'm not going to talk too much about coatings. Lenses have coatings. They're to do with letting in certain types of light and stopping other types of light from getting through. I'm not a coatings expert. All I know is that most modern scopes, if you're paying, you know, over £1,000 for a scope, the lens is going to be coated, and whatever these guys do to these things, it seems to do a good job. I get good clarity. So on the Delta, the reason I really like this scope is because it costs about $1,700, about the same in pounds, and for my money it compares up there with all the top manufacturers. So it compares to S&B, it compares to Night Force, it compares to Carles, it compares to Steiner. Glass quality wise, I can't really tell the difference. It's robust. I've put, on this particular one, I've put a few thousand 338 and 50 cal through it, and it's not a problem. Never had an issue with it. And it's got a 10-year warranty, so if it goes wrong, it'll get sent back, but it hasn't. It's got an illuminated reticle. It's one other thing you might want to touch on if you're picking a scope. Illuminated reticles are really useful if you're shooting in low light, or a really dark background and a dark target, so low contrast target to background. The reticle can disappear if the background and the target are a similar dark colour to your reticle. It really becomes impossible to see. I don't like ridiculously illuminated reticles, but on this there's just a central dot, which is the only thing I actually need to know about on the reticle to make a shot, is where is the central dot on the reticle. And this just puts, it's got 11 levels of illumination. It's like the Spinal Tap of illuminated scope dials, but it will go, I normally have it like at 2 or 3 because I don't want it glaring in my eye, I don't want it putting me off, I don't want it obscuring the target, I just want it enough so I know where it is. That's it. You're not using it for anything else other than just to know where it is. So that's about the end of the section. If you guys are interested in this, I'll put some Amazon links up. Please use those, or if you want to buy anything else on Amazon, just click through those links. That subsidizes the channel, and you know, we can bring you more things to review if we're subsidized, and we can buy more things, because most of the things that are going to appear on here are purchased. They're not things that I've acquired any other way. If you're going to choose a scope and you're looking at spending a lot of money, my suggestion would be go and try some, get down the range. There will always be friendly guys down there. If you're military and law enforcement, you're probably going to end up having to use whatever you've got issued to you, but you can still maybe exert some influence, so you can go to shows, have a look through scopes, go to SHOT Show or whatever, take a look, and then give your bosses a hard time about what they should be tendering for next. And yeah, hopefully you'll end up with something pretty decent. But I like these Deltas, also like Vortex because of the warranty. Use a few of those as well. So thanks a lot. I'll see you next time. If anyone's got any questions about the scopes, or any questions about features and benefits of these things, how they work, you're having problems with yours, leave them in the comments below, and I'll get back to all comments, I promise you. Thanks a lot. Take care now.